Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Stevens with a short lecture on verse narrative. And let me begin by explaining that the main reason for this lecture is that normally narrative is studied in a course such as this, that is, a course that is essentially an introduction to reading literature. Narrative is usually introduced in the form of the short story and the novel. Short story and novel are essentially modern forms of narrative. Narrative has a very ancient history, and for thousands of years, narrative was a form of poetry. It was written in verse. And so that's the main reason that in literary genres I have a short unit on verse narrative, simply as a way of doing paying attention to or honoring that tradition, the origins of narrative as poetry. Okay, so you could call this a lecture on the narrative as poetry. But we're not going to be going into a great deal of detail. The main reason, as I say, is simply to observe that important fact that narrative, that is, stories, were not always in the form of what we now call fiction, that is, short story and novel. So, but we need to begin. We need to begin by saying something about what narrative is before we get on to the subject of narrative in verse. So a simple definition then is that narrative is a story with a plot. What do we mean by story? Story here, in the sense that I'm using it, simply means a sequence of events. First one thing happened, and then something else happened, and then something else happened after that. So a story in that sense, that is just a sequence of things that happen, can have a shape, but not necessarily. The shape that we get in a narrative is, and I'm going to highlight this for you, the shape is what we call plot. So let's go into that in a little more detail with a more complex definition, okay? A narrative is a story, okay? And a story is a sequence of events, but it is a sequence of events that forms a plot, where plot is the structure of the events, okay? And this is very important, the structure of the events. And what do we mean by structure? A structure is simply something that in some way holds together to form a whole. We use the word structure to refer to buildings, right? Whether it's something as simple as a house or as complex as a skyscraper, we say, oh, that's a structure. Why? Because a house or a skyscraper holds together in some unified whole. All right? Now, if we take that sequence of events and we give it a structure, that is, we make it a unified whole, all right, then we do that. We have a plot, and we do that by making sure that the events in that story are in some way related to each other. So let's look at an example. And please, this is not a verse narrative. I've chosen this because it is short, you can read it in just a minute or two, and because I think it clearly illustrates what we mean by a sequence of events or story that has a plot. It's an old story, I believe, comes out of ancient Persia. I'm not sure. Some of you may have come across this story. It's used sometimes as an example of irony, which it is. I'm not using it as an example of irony, although I hope you will see the irony in it. I'm simply using it as an example of story or sequence of events that has a plot. So here it is. There was a merchant in Baghdad who sent his servant to market to buy provisions. And in a little while the servant came back white and trembling and said, "Master, just now when I was in the marketplace, I was jostled by a woman in the crowd, and when I turned I saw it was Death that jostled me. She looked at me and made a threatening gesture. Now lend me your horse, and I will ride away from this city and avoid my fate. I will go to Samarra, and there Death will not find me." The merchant lent him his horse, and the servant mounted it and dug his spurs in its flanks, and as fast as the horse could gallop he went. Then the merchant went down to the marketplace, and he saw Death standing in the crowd, and he came up to Death and said, "Why did you make a threatening gesture to my servant when you saw him this morning?" "That was not a threatening gesture," Death said. "It was only a start of surprise. I was astonished to see him in Baghdad, for I had an appointment with him tonight in Samarra." All right. Okay. Simple story, sequence of events. All right. By the way, we may as well point out 3 basic elements of narrative here, and we'll be getting into those as we go along with short story and novel. But 3 basic elements. Not only do we have a plot, we also have characters, and we have a setting. All right. So in this particular case, right, our setting simply refers to time and place of the story. When does the story take place and where? Okay. And we have characters. Who are the characters? We have a merchant. Okay. One character. We have a servant, another character, and who's that third character? You know, don't you, right? That third character is Death. And interestingly enough, Death is personified as a she. Interesting. Okay. So, and then we have a sequence of events. What's the sequence of events? Well, the first thing that happens is the merchant sends his servant to the market. The next thing that happens is the servant comes back. These are things that happen, right? The third thing that happens is the servant talks. And the servant tells this little story about what happened to him in the marketplace. All right? And then we skip over, we can divide this little conversation into different events, such as the lending of the horse and so on. But let's move on to the main events here. Okay, so next major event is the servant mounts the horse and rides, presumably rides to Samarra, right? Okay. Next event, the merchant goes down to the marketplace and talks to Death. So there is this conversation. The merchant says something to Death, and then Death says something, right? The end. Sequence of events. Now, how are these events related? Well, in a good many stories, they are related in terms of a particular problem that the story as a whole is addressing. All right? Now, it might not necessarily be a problem, could be a situation of some kind that the story is addressing, but there is some central situation or problem or issue or question that forms the focus, and then that is the unifying principle, if you will, all right, for the story, for the plot. Remember, we're talking about plot. So when we talk about plot, we say the events are not just random events, one after another. They happen in a sequence, in a particular relationship to each other. What forms that relationship, then, is the situation that, or the focus, if you will, that the events are related to. All right, so in this particular story, the central situation is that the servant is, pardon the pun, scared to death, isn't he? Okay, the servant has encountered death in the marketplace and decides he needs to do something about this. That's the central situation. So what happens then? What he does is related to that fear that he has, because death is in Baghdad and he's afraid of death. Okay, so he's going to get away as fast as he can. So that's how that particular event is related. And then what the merchant does, going down to the marketplace and so on, obviously is also related to that. And the conclusion, finally, and there is always some kind of resolution, okay? Some kind of resolution. In this particular case, it is an explanation. An explanation of the situation that, of course, is ironic, because ironically, in trying to escape death, the servant has run into death. Okay? So we see simple little story, sequence of events, characters, setting, and we see that all of those events are somehow related to each other. They have a plot. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to narrative, a story with a plot. So keep that in mind. Now, what is a verse narrative? Well, a verse narrative, quite simply, is a narrative told in verse form, which leads to the question, what is verse? Now, in the unit on lyric poetry, we talk quite a bit about verse. So I'm saying here that in a verse narrative, verse is the same as it is in lyric poetry. It is the sequence of lines across the page from left to right. And then when you get to the right-hand side, those words turn or they reverse. Okay, remember? Verse simply means to turn. So when you reverse, what do? You turn and go back, don't you? All right, so they reverse at the right-hand side and they go on to the next line. Here is the important thing, folks. Verse is something that must be heard. Otherwise, there's no point in it. Okay? Now, we read poetry on the page, but we're making a big mistake if we read it without actually hearing it. All right? So, what do I mean it must be heard? We say it is the sound of the words. The sound of the words, and the verse is the governing principle, the line. Okay, the line is the governing principle here in forming the sound. So we say it's the sound of the words with the sound starting. Okay, it starts. And of course, if you want to think in terms of the visuals again, in terms of the written word, it starts at the left-hand side, right? But it starts, the sound starts. Okay, I'm going to pause. Then I'm going to start again, all right? So, the sound starts, and then it stops. Okay, it stops when it comes to a little pause at the end of the line, and then it is followed by the resumption of the sound at the beginning of the next line, okay? Resumption of the sound, here we go. That's the word I want there. The resumption of the sound. The sound resumes. It begins again at the beginning of the next line. So here's an example from Robert Frost's Story in Verse. Okay, a short one, admittedly. Okay, you can read this story in 10 minutes. It's a short story. It is written in verse. Here's the verse. Here's the beginning. Okay, so we've got, whoops, didn't mean to go down that far. Okay. Forget it. Okay? Forget it. Now, when I read this, I'm going to emphasize the sound because that is, as I say, the important principle here. Not the fact that your eye sees words starting at the left and words stopping at the right. That's not the important principle. The important principle is that when you get to the right, there is that slight pause. So I'm going to emphasize that. Mary sat musing on the lamp flame at the table, waiting for Warren. When she heard his step, she ran on tiptoe down the darkened passage to meet him in the doorway with the news and put him on his guard. Silas is back. Okay? One more time. Mary sat musing on the lamp flame at the table, waiting for Warren. When she heard his step, she ran on tiptoe down the darkened passage to meet him in the doorway with the news and put him on his guard. Silas is back. Now, the verse form here, all right, and I'll put that up here, all right. The verse form is blank verse in this particular case. And blank verse is unrhymed pentameter. Iambic pentameter. Okay, unrhymed iambic pentameter. And here's how it goes. I'm not going to go into detail about the nature of iambic pentameter. That is covered in the unit on lyric poetry. But iambic pentameter has a particular sound to it. All right. Mary sat musing on the lamp flame at the table, waiting for Warren. When she heard his step, she ran on tiptoe down the darkened passage to meet him in the doorway with the news and put him on his guard. Silas is back. Okay, so the idea here, folks, is simply that you hear that rhythm. Now, this is not strict iambic pentameter. It's a very, very flexible iambic pentameter, but that is the basic underlying rhythm, is the da-dum, 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 da-dum. To meet him in the doorway with the news. She ran on tiptoe down the darkened passage. Okay? The rhythm, that's the important thing. And iambic pentameter, blank verse, is one of the best and most important, most widely used forms of verse for the verse narrative. Okay? And we'll see this when we look at the history. And the history, then, is the important point. Getting back to what I said in the introduction, this is the important point. I hope you can still see this if I highlight it. And it is the reason for a short unit on verse narrative. The genre we call narrative, okay, commonly referred to in courses such as this, literary genres, that is, an introduction to literature. It's commonly called fiction. It actually began as poetry thousands of years ago, folks. Thousands of years ago. It is only in modern times that what we think of as fiction came to be written primarily in prose, no longer poetry, no longer verse. Or I should say, because it is no longer verse, it is no longer poetry, at least in the strictest sense. But, as I said, for thousands of years, narrative, that thing that we now study as fiction, narrative was in verse, and because it was in verse, it was poetry. So let's look at the very beginning. The very first major genre of narrative was the epic poem. Doesn't mean that all stories were epic poems, but this was until the time of the Renaissance, that is 16th into 17th century, just a few hundred years ago. The epic poem was considered the most important, the what you might call the big daddy of literature. The most important, the highest form of literature was the epic poem. And important examples for writers of epic poetry are the Iliad and Odyssey of Homer and the Aeneid of Virgil. In English literature, we have examples of epic poetry, and the examples I'm giving you here are Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. What is an epic poem? An epic poem is a long, long story about the adventures of a hero. That is, someone of a heroic stature, bigger than life, stronger, braver, more talented, and so on. Hero in that sense. Now, in the Middle Ages, about the 12th century and for a couple of hundred years after, an important form of verse narrative, that is a narrative in poetry form, poetic form, was the Romance. Now, the Romance is related to the heroic epic, and it is the story about a knight on a quest, and as I say, often told in verse, and that's our concern here, is the romances that were verse romances, meaning they were stories in the form of poetry. In the history of the literature of the Renaissance, that is, the literature of the 16th and 17th centuries, there are two dominant epics. That is the Faerie Queene and Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, a couple of qualifiers here. First of all, the Faerie Queene is not simply a heroic epic, it is also a romance. It's actually a series of romances, so it combines both of those genres. But they are long, long stories about the adventures of a hero, or perhaps in the case of the Faerie Queene, several heroes actually. All right? So long stories, but these are the last. These are the last of the so-called epic poems in English. Now, the epic poem, I don't mean the epic poem, but the long story in the form of a poem, or the long narrative in verse, did not die with Paradise Lost. All right, Aurora Leigh in the 19th century by Elizabeth Barrett Browning is a novel in verse. All right, so it is a novel in the form of a poem. All right, and also in the 19th century, Idylls of the King by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Another, Idylls of the King, by the way, is the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, told in poem form, in verse by Tennyson. Another long story. You could say this is a 19th century version of the romance that we talked about, the adventures of knights on quests and so on. And I should put in here that Aurora Leigh is by Barrett Browning, I think there's probably supposed to be 2 T's on that. Okay, and then we have Idols of the King by Tennyson. Okay, so, and the novel in verse, occasionally somebody will try a novel in verse there, as I think recently somebody wrote a novel in the form of a sequence of sonnets. Okay, that is short poems and so on. Okay, so the long verse narrative is still occasionally written, but has been mostly replaced by the novel. All right, so the long epic poem no longer exists, but we still have long stories with many of the same elements of the ancient epic poem, but these stories are now in the form of prose, no longer in verse. Finally, we've got the ballad, and the ballad goes back a long ways to the Middle Ages. And the ballad is a narrative in the form of a lyric poem. That is a short poem, condensed, concise, with the kind of lyrical intensity that lyric poems have, and also, as is the case with lyric poems, remember that the lyric poem goes back originally to the origins of song. So lyric poems and songs are very closely related, and ballads then were always in the form of some kind of song. They could be sung, and so our example here and the example that we read in this course is Sir Patrick Spens. All right, so our 2 verse narratives, the ones that we focus on in literary genres, are Sir Patrick Spens and Frost's The Death of the Hired Man. However, I have given you examples of other verse narratives. They are posted in Blackboard under course documents in a folder called Verse Narrative. So if you want to look at other examples, please do so there. Click on course documents, click on that folder that says Verse Narrative. So what are we to conclude then? The verse narrative has the same basic elements as does what we call fiction. That is the novel and the short story. Okay? It has a plot. Remember we talked about plot up there, Appointment in Samara, right? It has a setting. All right? This is true of the really short ones, folks. The really short verse narratives like Sir Patrick Spens or Death of the Hired Man. There's a plot, there's a setting, there are characters, and something that we didn't talk about yet, but we don't need to because that will come up later. We're concerned here primarily with the phenomenon of verse, okay? But it has theme. But here's the important point. This is something that the short story and the novel, that is, narratives in prose, have for the most part lost. Your narrative in verse adds to these other elements, plot, setting, character, and theme. To these elements it adds the regular rhythm that is the inherent character of verse. Again, that sound that we get. Okay, the king sits in Dunfermline town, drinking his blood-red wine. Opening of Sir Patrick Spens. Or Mary sat musing on the lamp flame at the table, waiting for Warren. When she heard his step, she ran on tiptoe down the darkened passage to meet him in the doorway with the news and put him on his guard. Silas is back. The sound, the rhythm of poetry is what verse narrative has. Thanks for listening, folks, and I look forward to reading what you have to say as we discuss narrative in verse.